How much have state budgets been taken over by the federal government? Is anything wrong with the Bureau of Labor Statistics? And what's nationalist about trade surpluses? I'm Dominic Pino, economics editor at National Review, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from your state capitol building, whichever state you're in. So most people know that in the United States, we have a federalist system of government, and that means that there are responsibilities that state and local governments have that are different from those of the federal government. One of those responsibilities is raising revenue and passing budgets for public services and spending. And yet, we've seen a lot of overlap in recent years between the roles of the federal government and the state governments and an erosion in that federalist system. So to talk about that, I've got on the podcast today Tony Woodlief, who is a senior fellow with the Center for Practical Federalism at the State Policy Network, which is a group of free market think tanks all across the United States. So thanks so much for joining us, Tony.
Thanks for having me, Dominic.
So if you can sort of set the stage for us, what did the relationship of fiscal federalism, the relationship between revenue and spending and the state governments and the federal government, what did that used to look like, and what does it look like now?
Well, I mean, when the states created the national government, and they gave it enumerated powers. We've all learned that in our con law class, and so when the federal government, the national government, was essentially exercising those powers, there wasn't a lot of need for transfers to states. You don't need to send money to Connecticut generally for your armed forces unless you've got a base in Connecticut or a lot of troops live there. But over time, and John Cogan at Hoover Institute has really shown this with the data, over time, as the federal government branched beyond its enumerated powers, that's when you really began to get into fiscal trouble as a country. And so John shows, even if you were to agree that Medicaid and Social Security are national interests, that even though the founders didn't anticipate, and we want to add that to the list of enumerated powers, he says, even if you do that, if they had stuck to just that, we would have zero national debt. And instead, we're looking at 37 trillion. And his point is because the national government's doing a ton of stuff, and a lot of that involves, channeling money to the states to do its bidding, which then means they're adopting national DC priorities instead of priorities of their own citizens.
So most people pay income taxes to their state. If they don't pay income taxes, they pay sales tax. They pay property taxes to their local governments. And so I think people sort of have an intuition like, I'm paying separate taxes for that government. That must be where the money's coming from. But how much of the average state's budget now comes from the federal government?
The average state, this is the latest data from census is 2023, so end of year 2023. In most cases, some states have a weird fiscal year. The average state was getting about 37% of its revenues from federal sources, and that's about double what it was in 1990. So now we have a problem, right? Because that money isn't free. And when you have ideologues running federal agencies, which is about 100% of the time, they're going to start attaching strings to that money and issuing threatening letters, essentially saying, we'll take your money if you don't do these crazy things that we want. And often that lands on state and local government officials who just comply. Out of ignorance or ideological affinity, they just believe they have to do it, and they just do it. And then you have a bigger problem.
So we hear this all the time, this free money line, right? And you hear it from state level politicians all the time. And you would think that there would be a certain instinct that they would have to protect their own turf and to want to have a say over what goes on in their state. And yet most of them seem completely fine with it when it comes to taking federal money under the argument that it's free, that hey, we didn't have to raise taxes on our residents to pay for it. The federal government already did the taxes, so we might as well take it because that won't require us to raise taxes on our own. What's wrong with that way of thinking?
Well, for starters, there are costs that most states, like, so my group, the Center for Practical Federalism at SPN, one of the first things we built was a federalism scorecard where you rank all 50 states on a variety of nerdy factors to assess their vulnerability to federal influence. And one of the things we found is that most states don't require their state agencies to do a full accounting of the total costs of receiving any federal grant. So one example is if they hire employees with that money, they become state employees. Now you've got long-term pension liabilities, right? If they build facilities with the federal money, well, who's going to keep up the insurance, the maintenance, all that stuff? They don't do a proper accounting, and so the dollars aren't completely free. And one of the most pernicious examples is something called maintenance of effort requirements, which is if you take this money for some aspect of your school system, well, you only keep getting the money if you don't reduce your spend of your own items you're paying for. And so then zero efficiency from here forward. So that it's not free money, but people believe it is. And also, this is what it ought to be embarrassing to Republicans. A lot of these states that are getting a ton of money, more than average, are Republican-run states that have cut their taxes. So it's a way to pose as a fiscal conservative. We're cutting taxes. We're keeping government small. No, you are not. You're just importing the federal dollars, and now you're doing what they tell you. So there's nothing conservative about that. You didn't shrink government, and you're letting people who don't even live here tell you what to do. I don't know. That's not a definition of conservatism, in my view. So I think it's just a cheap way to stay elected and not do your job.
Yeah, I can always think of a handful of occasions where this went the other way. The one that always comes to mind for me is when the Obama administration, for its shovel-ready jobs after the recession, they wanted to build a bunch of rail projects in different states. And there were a handful of Republican governors, Scott Walker in Wisconsin, John Kasich in Ohio, and Rick Scott in Florida, who turned down that money. And they sent it back and they said, we don't want that. We don't want the federal government telling us what to do with our transportation funding. And there was a lot of gloating by Democrats about this because they turned down the free money. How stupid could they be? And of course, some of that money ended up going to California's high-speed rail project, which still has not carried a single person or even laid a single mile of track, more than a decade later. I look at that and I say, this was a great success for the conservative idea of turning down that money. And yet it seems like the exception and not the rule. Why don't Republicans see that worked out well? All three of those guys got reelected. What's the problem?
I think even if you had more of this kind of rejection of these little discretionary one-offs, you still got these massive grants that are going to come in, like Medicaid, for example. But I think it really is this internal calculus that this is going to mean jobs, this is going to mean spending in the state, no attention to the displacement effect. And I think it's just this sort of casual disregard for economic reality, which we, of course, know politicians excel at that. So I think that's part of it. So part of what we try to do, it's sort of a re-education effort or an education effort to help state and local officials who want to do the right thing understand the extent to which federal agencies are attaching strings to grants that they have no authority to attach, because those can be debated and argued, even litigated, and also federal guidance, which is not legally binding, but most people don't realize that. And that's another way agencies use the dollars to get what they want. So for us, we figure step one is stop doing stuff you don't have to do. Keep taking the money for now, but stop doing the stuff you don't have to do. And then step two is, a deeper question of, are there ways to do this better for less internally and be free of these agencies altogether? And that's a heavier lift, but I think the time is coming when you're not going to have much choice, because $37 trillion in debt, the Loper case has undermine the ability of agencies to creatively interpret the law. Now you've got all these non-delegation cases that will undermine the ability of Congress to write a blank check for power to an agency. So you're going to have this momentum back to block grants. I think it's sort of inevitable, if only for Congress to be performative, like to look like they're doing something. And so I think either way, states are going to be in a position where they have to decide how to administer these programs using more of their own resources, because they're just not going to have the same level of dollars coming from DC, you know.
Mm-hmm. And what makes block grants better than the system we have right now?
Well, it creates the opportunity for corruption with a block grant just gets pushed a little bit further down the chain. So, I mean, I'm fairly conservative, but I'm very sympathetic to my liberal friends who are like, "Oh my gosh, Tony, you can't give like Mississippi a block grant for welfare. They'll spend it all on Brett Favre's, athletic camps and stuff." And that has been a problem. States misuse block grant money to support other interests. I mean, that's a reality, but it's a heck of a lot easier to deal with that kind of corruption than when it's a federal agency writing all the rules and adding rules to it. So you create more flexibility at the state and local level on how the money should be spent towards whatever ends it's assigned for. And you see that where you've got more innovative state agency officials, they can tell you all the ways that DC gets in the way. Like state of Tennessee, their Department of Human Services, I spent a little time with them last year, and they talked about how, golly, some of these federal grants, they're supposed to help the disadvantaged. You can't use them to test whether the programs you've created are actually helping the disadvantaged. You can't use the money to test whether the money is being effectively spent. Like that kind of stuff. Like you get rid of all that with a block grant.
And can you give some more examples of some of the strings that are attached? Because I think a lot of times people don't really know what those are.
Sure. Like, so we saw, with certainly spent a lot of money through Department of Transportation under Joe Biden. And oh boy, like you got to make sure that, the money you're spending, a certain amount goes to, subcontractors with these physical characteristics that please the people in Washington. And you have to have these kinds of green components that may not really help anyone. They layer in things that were not in the original authorizing statute that are their own priorities. Often under Biden and under Obama, those priorities had to do with race, gender, sexuality. That's sort of their pet projects. When it's Republicans in charge, you get different kinds of priorities, but it's always somebody you didn't vote for deciding to get this money that Congress is trying to appropriate. You have to do additional things that make them happy,
And no matter what happens, we've got two parties in the United States. One of them is going to be in control roughly half the time. So you'd think there would be some appetite from Democrats or from Republicans to claw some of that power back to their states, because they're going to have to think, well, about half the time, I'm not going to like whoever's in charge in DC, and I'm not going to like these strings that are attached. Even if the other half of the time I do like it and I agree with it politically, why is that 50-50 split seem to be accepted?
Dominic, at my most pessimistic, I think that a lot of politicians like it this way. When the other party's in charge, you raise more money. You get to complain, oh, they're turning all our kids into transgenders, write me a check. The best thing for the Democratic parties in various states right now is Donald Trump. Best thing for Washington Post is Donald Trump. Like, it's this sick kind of cycle that both parties have. So I think at some level, when they're in charge, they can do what they want for a while. When they're not in charge, they can make money through direct mail. So why fix it?
Yeah. It's bleak, but there's certainly a grain of truth to it. So what are some things that state policymakers can do to actually get control back, like the Constitution says? Some of the things you described sounds illegal, sounds like the kind of thing you could take to a court and win a lawsuit over. Has that been effective?
Well, so one thing like that my group is focused on is federal guidance, which is this kind of sub-regulatory matter. It's directives from federal agencies that purport to explain the law, to clarify it. But under President Obama, and then much more so under Biden, agencies were using it as a secret way to issue new regulations. And so just one little example, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, federal government level, under Biden, they issued a Dear Colleague letter, a piece of federal guidance that said, we believe what the law means is that if you have a state Medicaid office, which every state does, and you're using federal dollars, which every state does, then you need to have on staff translators for the top 15 languages in your state. So then the state of Michigan, if Tagalog is number 15 in the languages, they have to have now in their contract, somebody who can speak Tagalog in case one of the 3,000 people in Michigan who speaks Tagalog happens to call the state Medicaid office and need help. So that's a hard expense imposed on every state. Zero political authority or legal authority for CMS to do that. But states just comply. We've found because they just don't know otherwise. And so part of what we've done is go talk to state lawmakers and governors and others and say, you don't have to comply with this. Refuse to comply and let them sue you. And then let's see what happens. And that can be a little daunting for people, but that's one area. Because if you try to sue over that kind of stuff, all that happens is you go to federal court and the agency says, hey, we're not threatening anybody. We're just trying to give helpful clarification. But we all know that they are threatening, right? They're holding a sword over your head. So the only way to deal with it is refuse to comply, usually. And then the same would go with those strings they attach to federal grants. So a lot of what we try to do is just give them the nitty gritty that they just don't have the research capacity to uncover these things for themselves. So that's part of what we do is just put it in front of them and say, all right, do something now.
Yeah, I feel like that's a big part of why it continues is because there's just so much of this federal guidance, so much that gets added to regulations every year that there's no possible way states could. I mean, even if they had bigger staffs, even if they, had twice as many people researching this stuff or whatever, there's just no possible way they could actually parse through it all. There's just so much.
It's true. So one thing we've done, we worked in a few states, and we'll do more in the next session. We've helped state legislatures pass laws that require their state agencies to disclose the federal guidance that they receive, which is step one, because usually the stuff that the agency knows is illegal, they don't publish it on their website. They send it directly to their target. And so the law requires that disclosure. And then we've been working on some AI tools to help read this stuff fast, because our experience is the illegal stuff, the stuff that's really secretly regulation, it gets worded a bit differently than the stuff that's more clarification. The latter tends to be like technical details, and the former, the illegal stuff, it's worded like, a sleazy lawyer would word something. So we think AI can tell the difference, and that's what we're working on.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I hope that works. I think it's important too for listeners to understand the difference between those guidance documents and regulation, or what's supposed to be the difference, because at the federal level, and then of course at state levels too, there are administrative procedure acts that describe the process by which regulations have to be adopted. And that usually involves a public notice and comment period where interested stakeholders in the regulation get to have a say in how it's made. They get to critique it and improve it, and it's a process that involves positive and negative feedback, and it usually results in regulations being altered in some way and tried to make a little bit more sensible, because there is a genuine learning process that goes on between the government and businesses and individuals and so on. Even if we think there's way too much regulation, which of course I do, that process of adopting it is at least better than simply doing it from a Dear Colleague letter that was written by an administrative agency with no input from anybody outside the agency, and was probably done for political purposes by the elected officials who are in charge of that. And so that difference in the fact that we saw under Biden and a real increase in that style of regulation, I think should be concerning just from a basic point of view of democratic accountability.
Yep. And you're going to see more reliance on guidance, is my prediction, because the Loper decision makes it harder to pass regulations in a legitimate manner. So there's no penalty for an agency trying something out with guidance. If they get called on it, they can just walk it back. So, and they're accustomed to people just immediately complying. So it's a really attractive lane for people who have no scruples. And And to make it worse, one thing our team flagged in January was in the last 3 days of the Biden administration, their Department of Justice finalized a rule that essentially allows federal agencies, at least ones represented by Department of Justice, which is most of them, to use guidance in enforcement proceedings against their targets to basically say, well, Dominic, look, we sent you this Dear Colleague letter saying that the microphone that you use in your podcast is not regulation length. We warned you. You kept using that doggone microphone. So we're going to take that as your intent. That's proof that you intended to break the law. So that's how they want to use guidance. And so that will, of course, enshrine guidance further. And so we flagged that as something that, because of technical reasons, even right now, if Congress wanted to, it could strike it down using Congressional Review Act. I could get into the reasons why, but the clock never started ticking on getting rid of that rule. So that's the kind of stuff our hope is that people who are pro-freedom in Washington, who want to knock back the federal administrative state, there are things like that they can do to sort of alter the rules of the game around how guidance is used by agencies.
Yeah, and that was an interesting point you bring up too about how this was done in the last couple of days of the Biden administration. We saw this with previous administrations too, that they wait until the last few days in January before the next president is inaugurated to do a whole bunch of stuff. Why is that, and what's the advantage from the administrator's point of view of doing it that way?
You know, I'm mystified about this particular rule because, just to be a nerd for a second, it had been enshrined as an interim final rule, which means they used a bit of chicanery to make it a formal regulation without ever submitting it to Congress. And the way they did it is they said, well, this is just a matter of personnel management, which you don't have to submit those formally to Congress. Well, it's like me saying, look, I'm going to give all my park rangers, bazookas to use on people who are fishing incorrectly. It's just a matter of personnel management. I'm just managing my personnel by giving them bazookas. Well, no. So I don't know why they finalized the rule, because when they did that, they opened it up to congressional review. So I think sometimes it's a performative effort. These are ideologues, and they want to get the win. For them, the win is, right, we made the rule, we made the law. And I think also, I don't think we've seen enough aggressive use of Congressional Review Act. So if you're a bureaucrat, why not take a shot? You're a hero with your likely funders in whatever job you're going to go to in whatever NGO while you wait for your party to take the White House again. And maybe the rule will stick, so why not?
So as we look at the vision the founders had for the relationship between the federal and the state governments and what we have today, what do you think the prospects are for moving back in that direction? Is there an appetite for it among state lawmakers? Do you think that appetite is stronger among state lawmakers in some places or other places, or one party or another party? Or do you think that the trend is still moving more towards federal control of state budgets?
Well, the trend is depressing because it's, the average state gets 37% of its revenue from federal sources now, which is double what it was in 1990. I think the upper constraint is $37 trillion in debt. How much more? How many more loans can the national government take on? So there is sort of an upper bound. I think there's some states like Utah is probably at the forefront of exploring ways to get out of this federal dependency, to get these agencies out of their schools and their nursing homes and so on. So there's some pockets of that. But it's very difficult, I think, for politicians, especially if they've had their careers built around cutting all the state and local taxes as low as they can go. Well, then that means you either get rid of certain services, or you raise your own taxes, or you keep letting Washington, D.C. do it for you. So I think it's an uphill battle to restore that sense of self-governance. But I think we're going to be pushed in that direction because the federal government can't keep, I would hope, spending all this money, or at least spending it the same way. So you're probably going to see more of what we saw in the big, beautiful bill, right, where you've got more state cost sharing. And once you do that, you can begin to change the dynamic. And I don't have to tell you, the Medicaid is where you probably have to begin to reform those insane incentives. And then you kind of try to emulate that in other programs.
Yep, and if listeners want to learn more about Medicaid, they should go back and listen to the episode we did with Paul Winfrey and Brian Blace, where we talked about that exact issue. But thanks so much for being on with us, Tony. This was a little bit depressing, but I hope that more people at the state level are becoming aware of the powers they have to bring back fiscal federalism in this country.
Thanks for having me, Dominic.
So you may have heard that Donald Trump fired the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's not usually something that happens. Bureau of Labor Statistics is a very boring part of the government that is not usually involved in political controversies. And that's on purpose. We don't want the Bureau of Labor Statistics to be involved in political controversies. And they really didn't do anything to involve themselves in this. Donald Trump thinks that the jobs report is rigged against Republicans. He said as much in a social media post right after announcing that he was firing Erica McIntyre, who was the commissioner. And there's really just not evidence of this. If you look over time, the errors in the jobs report go in both directions under presidents of both parties, and the errors are in general pretty darn small. So a little bit of background about how the jobs report works. It usually gets big headlines every month when the jobs report comes out. Bureau of Labor Statistics is the government office that puts that together. And they do it with surveys. They send out one survey to households every month. They send out another survey to employers every month. And based on that, they estimate the number of jobs in the United States. Obviously, that's a really, really hard thing to do because there are so many jobs in the United States, so many different kinds of jobs in the United States. It's so hard, in fact, that if you ask, as the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, the employer survey says, how many people did you employ on the 12th day of the month? That's the date that they pick because it's in the middle of the month and usually not impacted by pay periods, which would happen a little bit later in the month. If you ask most big companies in the United States, how many people do you employ on the 12th of the month? They don't even know. They can give you a pretty good guess, but it's hard to say exactly on the 12th. Now, how many people did you employ over the course of the year? That's a much easier question because you can go and look through tax records and you can see how many people you paid in that year. But exactly on the 12th day of the month? I don't know. We know that somebody said that they were going to retire. They already announced they were retiring. We had their going away party, but did they officially quit yet? Or are they still on the payroll on the 12th? I know we said we were going to hire that one person and we interviewed them and they accepted it, but when was their start date again? I don't remember exactly. In really big companies where middle managers have a lot of authority to hire people, it can often be hard to get that information up to the top of the business in order to actually answer a survey accurately. And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a lot of statistically informed guessing about the jobs report. We all know that. It's inevitable. There's no other way to do it. Then there is a quarterly census of employers. That one is much more accurate because, again, the time span is bigger. The sample size is much bigger because it's not a sample, it's a census. It's of all employers in the United States. And so what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does is it uses that better data that only comes out once a quarter to revise its estimates that come out once a month. Makes perfect sense. They wait till the better data is available. then they go back and revise what they said in the previous months. And like I said, if you look at this over a historical time span, the errors go exactly how you would want them to go, which is randomly in both directions, up and down, and under presidents of both parties. That's a sign that they're not biased. True random statistical error should be positive just as much as it's negative. Now, in the real world, it's never going to be perfectly 50-50. But the BLS was pretty darn close to being perfectly 50-50, which means that their errors truly were random. Now, that's not to say there's nothing wrong with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Part of the survey methodology has been running into trouble in the last couple of years. Because especially on the employer side, the response rate to the survey is way down. It was never super high. It used to be in the 60% range. Now it's only in the 40% range. And it declined significantly during COVID, which you can expect, but then it hasn't recovered since then. And so those monthly reports on jobs are based on slightly worse data than were available 5 to 10 years ago. That's a problem. It's a problem that the BLS was working on solving. One of the things that they should do is something that the United Kingdom, for example, has done, which is for its jobs report, it has an online first methodology. They've been able to have better results with that. They've been able to do it cheaper. Now, the issue is it takes a one-time transition cost to design that new technology and deploy it for the first time. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics has seen its budget decline, adjusted for inflation, over the last 5 to 10 years. And so it just doesn't have the resources to do this right now. Now, the annual budget of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is about $700 million, which for government agencies is not a lot. And previous guest of this podcast, Bill Beach, who was the Commissioner of Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2019 to 2023, the way he says it is that the cost to modernize the jobs report survey will be about the same as the amount of money that the Pentagon spends on coffee in a year, which is to say somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars. It's not a huge amount of money for the federal government. And yet, despite Bill Beach and lots of other people going to Congress and saying, hey, we need this money to modernize this really important report, it hasn't happened. Now, listeners to this podcast know usually I am not a fan of increasing funding for government agencies. The reason is that most government agencies are either bad at their job or they're doing a job that shouldn't exist. I don't think either of these things apply to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. First of all, as I said before, they were getting just about as close to random statistical error as you could get, which means they are very good at their job. And not only that, the largest miss they've had. Professor Gary Wagner from University of Louisiana Lafayette did a comparison of this. The largest miss that they have had in over a decade on the jobs report is less than 1%. And the median miss on the number of jobs estimated in the United States is only 0.29%. That's astonishing. 0.29%? Are you kidding me? That's amazing. That's the median, which means half the time their miss is lower than 0.29%. That's incredible. So no, the BLS is not bad at its job. It has a hard job. And in the face of declining resources, really needs a boost in funding. The reason that I want the boost, too, is that, as Beach said, it's not a ton of money. It's not going to bust the budget. And in fact, it could help make the rest of the budget better. The reason for that is that the statistics that the BLS produces influence all sorts of different government programs. So if the BLS becomes better at collecting this data and disseminating it accurately, that's better for the budget overall. Because BLS statistics influence things like the cost of living adjustment for Social Security. That's one of the biggest budgetary items. And if that's a couple tenths of a percentage point different, we're talking about billions of dollars right there. So, and it's also important to say that the idea that the private sector can do this better, which, again, for most things government does, is probably true. But we have a private sector alternative to the BLS, and that's a company called ADP. They do a lot of the payroll processing for many big companies in the United States, and they put out their own jobs numbers. Well, they're not as accurate. They've been getting better in recent years, and maybe someday in the future they will be more accurate than the BLS, but right now the BLS does a much better job. And we know this is true because the private sector tells us. If the BLS reports were garbage and they were politically biased, that would be one thing for politicians to complain about. But financial markets, who don't really care who's president and just are interested in making money, they wouldn't pay attention to BLS reports if they were politically biased. But they do. And because they do, we know that they're reliable. Now, they pay attention to lots of other things too, and a lot of other private sector indicators as well. That's all fine and good. But it's important to note too that a lot of the statistics that the government collects are, in a way, a public-private partnership. The BLS uses private data for various different things. One of them that Bill Beach talked about last time he was on the show was insurance data from company AM Best. That goes into how the BLS looks at prices for insurance and things like that, which is a component of the price indexes that are used to estimate inflation. So the statistical apparatus of the U.S. government is really important. It is the best in the world. Other countries around the world wish that they had the statistical system that the U.S. does. And because the U.S. is the world's largest economy, our statistical system is, in effect, kind of the world's statistical system. Because if you look at the other big countries, you're not getting reliable statistics out of China. You're not getting reliable statistics out of Brazil or Russia. The U.S. is the leader here. If you want to be an America First nationalist, something you should be proud of. And it's unfortunate to see the reputation of the BLS be dragged through the mud and potentially the professionalism of the agency be harmed by a, frankly, unqualified nominee for the position to lead it. There's another aspect of inconsistency in the American nationalism that I want to get into, and that's about trade surpluses. Donald Trump, leader of the America First movement, is not a fan of trade deficits. I think we can say that with confidence. His executive order on tariffs is specifically designed to address trade deficits. He says that the trade deficit is a national emergency that requires government action from the executive unilaterally. And he reserves the right to set those rates and change them however he wants. That is what the executive order says. But it's weird for nationalists to be mad about a trade deficit because they could be just as mad. You can find just as many nationalist reasons to be upset about a trade surplus. And this is one of the issues that really illustrates Adam Smith's point, which is that there is nothing so absurd as the doctrine of the balance of trade. That's what Smith said in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And it was true then and it's true today. The whole idea of the balance of trade doesn't make sense. The whole idea of the balance of trade is subtracting exports minus imports, and then saying if it's a negative number, it's a deficit, and if it's a positive number, it's a surplus. The assumption built in there is that exports are better than imports. But really, they're two sides of the same coin. Because the opposite, or the counterpart, of a trade deficit is an investment surplus. When Americans buy stuff from foreigners, they pay in dollars. Those foreigners then get dollars. What do you do with dollars? Well, you buy stuff that's sold in dollars. And so people invest in the United States. They buy stock in American companies. They buy land in the United States. They buy U.S. government debt. And they buy exports from American companies. All those things are also good for America. It's good to have investment coming in. A lot of other countries around the world have entire diplomatic and economic initiatives to try to attract foreign investment. In the United States, they come crawling to us. We don't have to do anything. It's fantastic. In addition to that, the U.S. is the number one destination in the world for foreign direct investment. Now, you can try to say foreigners are evil for buying up stuff in the United States, but guess what? I'll tell you this. Xi Jinping would love for China to be the number one destination for foreign direct investment. This is a huge advantage the United States has over other countries in the world. It's that people want to invest their money here because they're confident in our economy, which is extremely diversified and extremely huge. And they're also confident that our government is going to uphold the rule of law. Because again, like I said in the statistical conversation earlier, think of the world's other really big countries. China, Russia, Brazil. These are not places that are stable, that have strong protection for property rights, that are going to tell you the truth and give you a fair trial. It's just not going to happen in those places for different reasons. But it's not going to happen. In the United States, it does. And that's why people want to invest here. It's awesome. It's one of the things we should be proud of. So if you get rid of the trade deficit, you reduce that investment problem. And you see this in Trump's own discussions. Trump is always bragging about how foreigners want to invest in the United States. He's right. That's a good thing. But part of the reason that happens is because of the trade deficit. So that's the first thing, that if we had a surplus, you would be going the other direction. And if you were going the other direction, that means American companies would be investing more abroad. Well, that doesn't sound very nationalist to me. We see this with countries where the U.S. has a trade deficit right now. So Trump's very mad about the trade deficit the U.S. has with Japan and with South Korea. Some of the biggest companies in those two countries are their car companies. Companies like Honda and Toyota in Japan, and Hyundai and Kia in South Korea. And they have trade surpluses with the United States, so you think that's a huge nationalist win for them, right? Well, not really, because what do both of those countries do? They invest a ton of money in the United States. And so Hyundai or Toyota have taken over decades billions of dollars worth of investment and put it into the United States to build state-of-the-art car manufacturing plants in the U.S. that Japanese and Korean people will never work in. So from the nationalist manufacturing point of view, why is that a good thing? Shouldn't they be investing that money in Japan or South Korea to give jobs to people in Japan or South Korea? Not only that, Trump's own logic in trade negotiations is that countries that have a trade deficit, countries with which the United States has a trade deficit, are in a vulnerable position because their economies are dependent on exporting to us. That's another way of saying they have a trade surplus, folks. Why in the world would a trade surplus be good for nationalism? Again, the overriding point here is that no matter what the balance of trade is, you can create a nationalist argument against it. And that shows that the concept itself is empty and meaningless, just like Adam Smith said. If nationalists can't decide based on their own principles whether a surplus or a deficit is a violation of them, and in fact, you can just as easily make an argument in either direction that logically is equally valid, then that probably means that there's not a whole lot to this concept to begin with. And that's true, because if we look around the world and you look at which countries are rich and which countries are poor, some of them have trade deficits and some of them have trade surpluses, and there's really no relationship between them. Australia has a trade surplus. It's a rich country. It's a nice place to live. Angola has a trade surplus. It's a poor country. It's not a very nice place to live. The United Kingdom has a trade deficit. It's a rich country. It's a nice place to live. Uganda has a trade surplus. It's a poor country. It's not a nice place to live. There's just not a lot of relationship here. And the reason is that nothing is more absurd than the doctrine of the balance of trade, because if a voluntary exchange happens for goods and both sides make the trade, the only reason they did it is because they both believe that they will be better off. Not that one is taking advantage of the other. If one was taking advantage of the other, the trade wouldn't have happened. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I picked the paper of the episode. It's from the University of Chicago Press in 2017 by Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth College, Clashing Over Commerce, A History of U.S. Trade Policy. Now, I'm slightly cheating here because Clashing Over Commerce is a book that was published by the University of Chicago Press, but I am highlighting it as a paper of the episode because each chapter is available on the National Bureau for Economic Research website as a paper individually, and you can go read them for free online, which is an incredible resource to have because Irwin's book is probably the most readable, accessible, and comprehensive history of U.S. trade policy that has been written in recent times. You can go check it out. And the advantage of it being split up into each chapter being its own paper on the MBER website is you don't have to read the whole book. If you want to just know about trade policy around the Civil War, you can go read that chapter. If you just want to know about trade policy in the 2 or 3 decades after World War II, you can go read just that chapter. And it's very easy to do that. So I recommend Professor Irwin's book. Again, it's called Clashing Over Commerce by Irwin. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.